The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat in the sterile FBI interrogation room, watching my entire career unravel through a one-way mirror. 6 years of dedication, countless sleepless nights chasing drug cartels through the Arizona desert, and a spotless record were about to disappear because of a single phone call. My father had just contacted Director Michael Torres, my boss, claiming I was mentally unstable, unreliable, and unfit for federal law enforcement. What Dad didn't know was that Michael wasn't just my superior. He was the man I'd been secretly dating for 2 years, the person who knew me better than anyone, and the one person who could see through every lie my father was about to tell. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my father tried to destroy my FBI career to prove a point about family loyalty, and how his plan backfired in ways he never could have imagined. This is about the night everything changed, the moment I discovered what my own blood relatives really thought of me, and how a secret love affair became the foundation for the most important fight of my professional life. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Phoenix. The desert sun was already blazing at 7 a.m., promising another scorching day in the field office. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the Sandra O'Connor Federal Building, the same routine I'd followed for 6 years since graduating from Quantico. My coffee was still steaming, my case files organized in the passenger seat, and my mind focused on the drug trafficking investigation that had consumed the last 3 months of my life. Agent Jessica Chen, my partner and closest friend at the bureau, was waiting by the elevator with her usual energetic smile and a stack of surveillance photos that meant we'd finally caught a break in the Morales cartel case. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt different that morning, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way Jessica kept glancing at me with concern, or perhaps it was the unusual quiet in the hallways as we walked past the administrative offices. The FBI field office in Phoenix was never this subdued, especially not during peak morning hours when agents were rushing between briefings and the phones never stopped ringing. Something felt off, like the calm before a desert storm that could appear out of nowhere and change everything in minutes. Director Michael Torres was already in his office when we arrived, visible through the glass walls that separated his workspace from the main floor. He looked up as Jessica and I passed, our eyes meeting for just a fraction of a second longer than appropriate for a superior and subordinate. That brief moment contained everything we couldn't say in public, all the warmth and concern and love that we'd been hiding for 2 years. Michael's dark eyes held a question I couldn't answer, a worry that seemed disproportionate to whatever case updates we might be discussing that day. His usually confident posture seemed tense, and I noticed his jaw was set in the way it got when he was trying to control his emotions. Our relationship had started innocently enough, professional discussions that gradually became personal conversations, coffee meetings that turned into dinner dates, and eventually the kind of connection that neither of us had been looking for but couldn't resist once we found it. We'd been incredibly careful, meeting at small restaurants outside the city, using encrypted messaging apps, and maintaining perfect professional boundaries at work. The FBI had strict policies about relationships between supervisors and subordinates, and we both knew that discovery could end both our careers. But what we had was real, deeper than either of us had experienced before, and worth the risk we took every day by keeping it secret. Jessica dropped the surveillance photos on my desk and leaned against the edge, studying my face with the intensity that made her such an effective interrogator. We'd been partners for 3 years, long enough for her to read my moods and know when something was bothering me, even when I couldn't articulate it myself. She was the only person at the bureau who suspected there might be something between Michael and me, though she'd never directly asked, and I'd never confirmed her suspicions. Our friendship was built on mutual respect and trust, but also on understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with your closest ally. The morning briefing proceeded normally, with updates on active cases and discussions of new intelligence from our contacts in Mexican law enforcement. I presented the latest findings on the Morales investigation, noting the pattern of money transfers that suggested a major shipment was planned for the following week. My presentation was thorough and professional, the kind of detailed analysis that had earned me commendations and promotions throughout my career. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was watching me more carefully than usual, his attention focused not just on my words but on my demeanor, as if he was looking for signs of something I didn't understand. After the briefing, I returned to my desk to find a voice message from my mother, which was unusual since Linda Mitchell rarely called during work hours. She understood that my job required focus and discretion, and she'd always been respectful of my professional boundaries even when she didn't fully understand what I did for the FBI. The message was brief and tense, asking me to call her back as soon as possible about a family situation that needed immediate attention. The tone in her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench with anxiety, the kind of maternal worry that suggested something serious had happened. I stepped into an empty conference room to return the call, closing the door behind me and activating the white noise generator that we used for sensitive conversations. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice strained in a way I'd rarely heard since childhood when Dad's police work had been particularly dangerous or stressful. She explained that my father had been making phone calls that morning, reaching out to contacts in law enforcement about concerns he had regarding my mental state and professional competence. The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable carrying the weight of betrayal and disbelief. According to Mom, Dad had spent the weekend researching FBI personnel policies and chain of command structures, apparently preparing for a systematic campaign to undermine my career. He'd started with former colleagues from his days with the Tempe Police Department, spreading rumors about my supposed instability and questioning whether federal law enforcement was too stressful for me to handle effectively. The conversations had escalated to include speculation about my personal life, my judgment, and my ability to maintain the security clearance that was essential for my position.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Each phone call was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my professional capabilities while presenting Dad as a concerned parent worried about his daughter's well-being. The motivation behind his actions was complicated, rooted in years of disappointment that I'd chosen federal law enforcement over following his path through local police work. Dad had always envisioned me joining the Tempe PD, working my way up through the ranks the same way he had, staying close to home and maintaining the family tradition of community policing. My decision to attend Arizona State University for criminology, then apply to the FBI Academy at Quantico, had been seen as a rejection of his values and guidance. In his mind, I'd gotten too big for my britches, chosen prestige over family loyalty, and needed to be brought back down to earth before I made mistakes that would reflect poorly on the Mitchell name. But this morning's phone calls represented an escalation that went beyond disappointed expectations or family disagreements. Dad had contacted the FBI field office directly, requesting to speak with Director Torres about concerns regarding Special Agent Sarah Mitchell's fitness for duty. He'd presented himself as a retired law enforcement professional with inside knowledge of problems that needed to be addressed before they became security risks. The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, during which Dad had systematically attacked my character, my judgment, and my psychological stability with the kind of detailed preparation that suggested weeks of planning. Mom's voice cracked as she described overhearing Dad's side of the conversation, the way he'd spoken about me like I was a dangerous liability rather than his daughter. She'd tried to intervene, to get him to reconsider the potential consequences of his actions, but he'd dismissed her concerns as maternal bias and insisted that tough love was necessary to save my career from my own poor decisions. In his mind, he was protecting me from myself, forcing a reality check that would make me humble enough to accept guidance and correction. The irony was devastating. He was destroying the very career he claimed to be trying to save. The immediate crisis was clear, but the deeper implications were still sinking in as I processed what Mom had told me. My father had essentially declared war on my professional life, using his law enforcement connections and insider knowledge to attack my reputation and credibility. Every case I'd worked, every arrest I'd made, every investigation I'd contributed to was now potentially suspect in the eyes of anyone who heard his accusations. The FBI took security concerns seriously, and even unfounded allegations could trigger internal investigations that would sidetrack my career for months or years. More personally devastating was the realization that Dad saw me as such a threat to family harmony that he was willing to risk my livelihood to reassert his authority. This wasn't about legitimate concerns for my well-being or professional development. This was about control, about punishing me for choosing independence over compliance, for building a life that didn't revolve around his approval and guidance. The man who had taught me about justice and integrity was now using manipulation and deception to undermine everything I'd worked to achieve. I ended the call with Mom and sat in the empty conference room, staring out at the Phoenix skyline while trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. In a few hours, I would need to face Michael professionally, knowing that he'd received a call designed to poison his perception of me and our working relationship. The cruel irony was that Dad's accusations about my personal life were closer to the truth than he realized. I was indeed involved in a relationship that could complicate my professional standing, just not in the way he imagined. The secret romance that had brought joy and stability to my life was now a vulnerability that could be exploited if Dad's investigation continued. Jessica knocked on the conference room door, peering through the glass with a concerned expression that suggested she'd noticed my extended absence. I waved her in, grateful for the interruption and the chance to focus on something other than the catastrophe unfolding around me. She sat down across from me, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the serious attention she brought to complex cases that required careful handling and strategic thinking. She'd heard rumors, she explained, about unusual phone calls and administrative concerns that were circulating through the office grapevine. Nothing specific, but enough to suggest that something was happening that could affect our team and our active investigations. The FBI was a hierarchical organization where information flowed through established channels, but it was also a workplace where agents developed informal networks that helped them navigate political complexities and office dynamics. Jessica's connections had picked up signals that something was amiss, though nobody seemed to know exactly what or how serious it might be. The afternoon stretched ahead with scheduled meetings and casework that would require me to maintain professional composure while my personal world collapsed around me. I had surveillance footage to review, witness statements to analyze, and coordination calls with DEA contacts who were tracking the same cartel networks we'd been investigating. The Morales case was reaching a critical phase where any distraction or loss of focus could compromise months of careful work and potentially endanger the safety of undercover agents who were depending on our support and analysis. But underneath the routine responsibilities, I was calculating the potential damage from Dad's campaign and trying to anticipate how Michael would handle the situation. As director, he would be obligated to take security concerns seriously, even when they came from sources with questionable motives. The FBI's internal affairs procedures were designed to err on the side of caution, which meant that even unfounded allegations could trigger administrative leave, security clearance reviews, and formal investigations that would effectively end my career regardless of their ultimate conclusions. The complexity of our secret relationship added another layer of risk that I'd never fully considered before this moment. If Dad's accusations prompted an internal investigation, every aspect of my professional and personal life would be scrutinized by investigators who were trained to uncover hidden connections and undisclosed relationships. Michael and I had been careful, but we hadn't been prepared for the kind of systematic examination that would result from security concerns raised by someone with law enforcement credentials and insider knowledge of FBI procedures. As the day wore on, I found myself watching Michael's office through the glass walls, looking for signs of stress or unusual activity that might indicate how he was processing Dad's call. He seemed to be conducting business as usual, meeting with other supervisors and reviewing case files with his characteristic attention to detail and calm professionalism. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward my desk, the slight tightness around his eyes that I'd learned to recognize during our 2 years together. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me as I prepared for what would inevitably be a difficult conversation. Dad had called Michael to warn him about my unreliability and poor judgment, not knowing that he was speaking to the person who knew me most intimately, who had seen me at my best and worst, who understood my strengths and weaknesses better than anyone else in my life. The man he was trying to convince that I was unfit for duty was the same man who had fallen in love with my dedication, integrity, and competence. Dad's strategy was doomed to fail, but not before it caused tremendous damage to relationships and trust that had taken years to build. The afternoon sun was setting behind the downtown Phoenix skyline when Michael finally appeared at my desk, his expression carefully neutral, but his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the vicinity. He asked if I could join him in his office for a few minutes to discuss some administrative matters, his tone professional but carrying undertones that suggested this would be more than a routine conversation. Jessica looked up from her computer with concern, understanding that late-day private meetings with the director rarely involved good news or simple updates. Walking across the office floor toward Michael's private space felt like traversing a minefield, every step weighted with the knowledge that my career and personal life hung in the balance. Other agents glanced up from their work, some with curiosity and others with the carefully blank expressions that federal employees used when they sensed political undercurrents they didn't want to get caught in. The FBI office was a small community, where rumors traveled fast, and everyone understood that individual careers could be derailed by forces beyond their control. Michael closed the door behind me and activated the privacy features that prevented outside surveillance or eavesdropping, standard procedure for sensitive discussions but also creating the intimate space where we could finally drop our professional masks and address what was really happening. For the first time all day, I was alone with the person who mattered most to me, the man whose opinion and support could make the difference between surviving this crisis and watching everything I'd worked for disappear. His first words weren't what I expected, and they changed everything about how I understood the situation and our relationship. Instead of interrogating me about Dad's accusations or questioning my fitness for duty, Michael stepped closer and asked quietly if I was okay, if there was anything he needed to know about my family's situation, and whether I felt safe and supported in dealing with whatever was happening. The concern in his voice was personal rather than professional, the kind of worry that came from love rather than supervisory responsibility. That's when I realized that Dad's plan had failed before it even started, not because his accusations were obviously false, but because he'd unknowingly contacted the one person who already knew everything about me that mattered. Michael had seen through the manipulation immediately, recognizing the call for what it was, a family power struggle that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns and everything to do with a controlling parent who couldn't accept his daughter's independence and success. The weight of carrying a secret for 6 years had shaped every aspect of my professional identity at the FBI. Growing up as the daughter of Sergeant Robert Mitchell meant learning early that perception mattered as much as reality in law enforcement. Dad had drilled into me from childhood that reputation was everything, that one mistake could destroy decades of careful work, and that family loyalty should always come before personal ambition. These lessons had followed me through Arizona State University, where I'd studied criminology while other students partied and enjoyed the freedom of college life. Even at Quantico, while my fellow recruits bonded over shared struggles and late-night study sessions, I'd maintained the careful distance that came from knowing my every move would eventually be reported back to Dad through his extensive network of law enforcement contacts. The FBI field office in Phoenix operated like a small city within the federal building, complete with its own culture, politics, and unwritten rules that governed everything from coffee breaks to career advancement. I'd learned to navigate these complexities by becoming indispensable, the agent who volunteered for overtime assignments, who could be counted on for accurate reports and thorough investigations, who never complained about difficult cases or dangerous field work. My clearance rate was among the highest in the office, my case files were models of organization and detail, and my testimony in federal court had never been successfully challenged by defense attorneys. But underneath this professional excellence was a constant awareness that I was performing not just for my supervisors, but for the invisible audience of Dad's contacts who might be watching and evaluating my worthiness to carry the Mitchell name in federal law enforcement. The irony of building such a stellar reputation while harboring the very secret that could destroy it wasn't lost on me as I sat in Michael's office that evening. Every commendation I'd received, every successful case I'd closed, every moment of pride in my career achievements had been shadowed by the knowledge that I was violating the trust placed in me by the FBI. The relationship with Michael hadn't started as a calculated risk or a moment of weakness. It had grown organically from professional respect into personal connection, then into the kind of love that made all the careful rules and regulations seem insignificant by comparison. But that didn't change the fact that I'd been living a double life for 2 years, maintaining perfect professional boundaries during work hours while sharing the most intimate aspects of my life with my direct supervisor after hours. The surveillance and counter-surveillance skills that made me effective in drug cartel investigations had become second nature in protecting our relationship. Michael and I had developed elaborate protocols for communication that relied on encrypted messaging apps, carefully scheduled meetings at locations far from the federal building, and a level of operational security that would have impressed our most paranoid intelligence contacts. We'd never been careless, never allowed emotion to override caution, never forgotten that discovery would mean the end of both our careers. The relationship had made me better at my job in some ways, providing emotional stability and personal fulfillment that allowed me to take risks and maintain focus during the most stressful investigations. But it had also created a vulnerability that I'd hoped would never be tested. Dad's phone call to Michael represented the collision of two worlds I'd worked desperately to keep separate. The family dynamics that had shaped my personality and values were now threatening the professional identity I'd built through years of careful work and sacrifice. Robert Mitchell had raised me to be strong, independent, and capable of handling any challenge that law enforcement could present. But he'd also raised me to be obedient, respectful of authority, and willing to subordinate my personal desires to family expectations. The contradiction between these lessons had been manageable, as long as my career success aligned with his vision of appropriate achievement. Once I'd exceeded his expectations and built something beyond his control, the very traits he'd instilled in me became threats to his authority that needed to be eliminated. The conversation with my mother had revealed the depth of Dad's resentment about my career trajectory, but it had also exposed the systematic planning that had gone into his decision to contact the FBI. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to a family disagreement or a moment of poor judgment triggered by stress or alcohol. Dad had spent weeks researching federal personnel policies, identifying the specific concerns that would be taken most seriously by FBI administration, and crafting accusations that would be difficult to disprove, even if they were completely fabricated. He'd used his law enforcement experience to construct a narrative that would bypass normal family counseling or intervention and go straight to the nuclear option of destroying my career. The calculated nature of his attack was more devastating than any emotional outburst or family confrontation could have been. Dad had weaponized his knowledge of law enforcement culture, his credibility as a retired police sergeant, and his understanding of my psychological makeup to create maximum damage with minimal risk to himself. If the plan succeeded, I would be neutralized as a threat to family hierarchy, while he maintained plausible deniability about his motives. If it failed, he could claim that he'd been acting out of legitimate concern for my well-being and the integrity of federal law enforcement. Either way, he would have demonstrated his power to reach into my professional life and create consequences for choices that didn't meet his approval. Michael's response to Dad's accusations had been everything I could have hoped for, and more than I'd dared to expect. Instead of treating the call as a serious security concern that required investigation, he'd recognized it immediately as a family manipulation designed to undermine my career. His questions about my safety and well-being showed that he understood the real dynamics at play, that this was about control rather than legitimate concerns about my professional competence. The relief of being believed, of having someone in authority see through Dad's strategy and respond with support rather than suspicion, was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. But Michael's protective instincts also highlighted the precarious position our relationship had created for both of us. As director, he had obligations to the FBI that went beyond his personal feelings about my situation or his confidence in my abilities. If Dad's accusations gained traction with other family members or law enforcement contacts, if they were repeated to media outlets or congressional representatives who oversee FBI operations, Michael would be forced to respond with formal procedures regardless of his personal knowledge of their falsehood. The man who loved me was also the official who could be compelled to suspend me, investigate me, or transfer me to protect the integrity of his office and the broader organization. The desert evening painted Phoenix in shades of orange and purple as Michael and I tried to process the implications of Dad's call and plan our response. The federal building was largely empty, except for security staff and a few agents working late on time-sensitive cases, giving us the privacy to speak openly about our relationship and its intersection with the crisis that was unfolding. For the first time in 2 years, we didn't have to pretend that we were only colleagues, didn't have to maintain the careful emotional distance that made our professional interactions seem natural to outside observers. The relief of dropping those masks was profound, but it was accompanied by the knowledge that we might never be able to put them back on if this situation escalated beyond our ability to control it. Michael's analysis of Dad's strategy was both professionally astute and personally infuriating. As someone who'd spent his career dealing with informants, hostile witnesses, and sophisticated criminal organizations, he could appreciate the tactical thinking that had gone into the attack on my reputation. Dad had identified the most effective pressure points, crafted accusations that would be difficult to investigate without causing damage, and timed his intervention to maximize disruption while minimizing his own exposure to consequences. From a purely operational standpoint, it was a well-executed campaign that showed significant understanding of bureaucratic vulnerabilities and organizational psychology.
But the personal betrayal involved in using those skills against his own daughter was something that Michael struggled to comprehend. His own family had been supportive of his law enforcement career, proud of his achievements, and respectful of the demands and dangers that came with federal service. The idea of a parent deliberately sabotaging their child's professional success was so foreign to his experience that he kept asking questions about Dad's motivation, looking for rational explanations that would make sense of such destructive behavior. I found myself defending Dad, even as I described his attacks, trying to explain the complex mixture of disappointment, control, and misguided love that had driven him to such extreme measures. The immediate tactical question was how to respond to Dad's call without escalating the situation or providing him with additional ammunition for future attacks. Michael's inclination was to ignore the accusations entirely, treating them as the family dispute they obviously represented rather than legitimate security concerns that required formal response. But his responsibilities as director meant that he needed to document the incident and consider whether other FBI personnel should be informed about potential ongoing harassment or interference. The bureaucratic requirements of his position were creating complications that our personal relationship couldn't resolve, no matter how much trust and understanding existed between us. The broader strategic challenge was protecting both our careers from the consequences of a relationship that we'd managed to keep secret for 2 years, but might not be able to hide much longer. Dad's investigation into my personal life suggested that he was looking for evidence of inappropriate relationships or compromising behavior that could be used to support his accusations about my professional judgment. If he discovered our connection, either through surveillance or by questioning mutual contacts, he would have exactly the kind of concrete evidence that could force Michael's superiors to take his concerns seriously, regardless of their obvious motivation. The stress of maintaining operational security while dealing with family crisis was beginning to take its toll as we discussed contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. Every decision we made about how to
handle Dad's attack had implications for both our professional standing and our personal relationship. Transparency about our connection would validate some of his accusations while potentially protecting us from worse consequences if the relationship was discovered through other means. Continued secrecy would preserve our careers in the short term but increase the risk of catastrophic exposure if Dad's investigation continued. There was no safe choice, no option that guaranteed protection for everything we'd built together. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Jessica, who'd stayed late to monitor developments and coordinate with our contacts in Mexican law enforcement about the Morales cartel investigation. Her update on surveillance activities and intelligence reports provided a welcome distraction from family drama, but it also highlighted the professional responsibilities that couldn't be postponed or delegated regardless of personal crises. The criminals we were tracking didn't care about FBI office politics or family conflicts, and any loss of focus or coordination could result in missed opportunities to prevent drug trafficking or protect undercover agents who were depending on our support. Michael's ability to compartmentalize personal and professional concerns was one of the qualities that had made him an effective director, but it was also creating distance between us as he shifted into crisis management mode. The man who had held me while I processed the emotional impact of Dad's betrayal was being replaced by the federal official who needed to protect the FBI from potential embarrassment or security compromise. I understood the necessity of his mental transition, but it was painful to watch him withdraw into the professional role that made honest communication about our relationship increasingly difficult. The desert wind was picking up outside the federal building, carrying dust and debris through the downtown Phoenix streets as we finalized our immediate response strategy. Michael would document Dad's call as a personnel matter that had been investigated and found to be without merit, creating a paper trail that would protect against future accusations while avoiding the formal internal affairs process that could spiral beyond our control. I would maintain normal work schedules and case responsibilities while monitoring for signs of continued interference or escalation from family members. We would continue our relationship but with enhanced security measures and reduced contact until the situation stabilized or resolved itself. The plan was logical and professionally sound, but it felt inadequate to address the emotional damage that Dad's attack had already caused. The trust that had been broken wasn't just between him and me, but between our family and the values he'd taught me to respect throughout my childhood and early career. The man who had inspired my interest in law enforcement, who had shaped my understanding of justice and integrity, had demonstrated that those principles only applied when they served his personal interests. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling the father I'd admired with the manipulative adversary who was trying to destroy my career was more difficult to process than any professional challenge I'd faced. As we prepared to leave the federal building that evening, Michael took my hand for just a moment, the first physical contact we'd shared during work hours in 2 years. The gesture was brief and probably invisible to anyone who might have been watching, but it carried the weight of everything we couldn't say in our professional environment. He was risking his career for that moment of connection, choosing to offer comfort and support despite the potential consequences if we were observed. The courage and love demonstrated by that simple touch was worth more than any formal protection or official response to Dad's accusations. The drive home through Phoenix's suburban neighborhoods gave me time to process the day's events and prepare for the family confrontation that was inevitably coming. Dad's attack on my career was just the opening move in a larger campaign to reassert control over my life and choices. He would be expecting capitulation, an acknowledgement that I'd overreached and needed his guidance to salvage what remained of my professional reputation. The conversation would require careful navigation between standing firm on my independence and avoiding provocations that could escalate his destructive behavior. The apartment complex in Scottsdale, where I'd lived for 3 years, had become a sanctuary from the demands and pressures of federal law enforcement, but tonight it felt exposed and vulnerable to outside scrutiny. Dad knew where I lived, had probably driven past the building multiple times while planning his attack, and might be conducting surveillance to gather additional evidence for future accusations. The paranoia was probably excessive, but 2 years of maintaining operational security for a secret relationship had heightened my awareness of potential observation and the importance of controlling information that could be used against me. The evening news was running a story about federal drug enforcement efforts along the Arizona-Mexico border, featuring footage of seizures and arrests that had resulted from investigations similar to the Morales case I'd been working. The reporter's description of FBI agents as dedicated professionals who risked their lives to protect communities from drug trafficking was ironic given the family crisis that was threatening to end my participation in that mission. Dad's view of my career as misguided ambition rather than public service showed how completely he'd lost sight of the values that had originally motivated his own law enforcement work. The apartment felt too quiet as I tried to focus on case files and preparation for the next day's activities. The routine tasks that usually provided structure and purpose seemed meaningless in the context of larger questions about family loyalty, professional identity, and the sustainability of living with secrets that required constant vigilance to maintain. The life I'd built through careful planning and disciplined work was under attack from the person who should have been most proud of my achievements, and there was no clear path forward that preserved everything I valued. Sleep was elusive as I replayed the day's conversations and tried to anticipate Dad's next moves in what had become a chess game with my career and relationship as the stakes. The man who had taught me to think strategically and plan for contingencies was now using those same skills against me, creating a situation where my training and experience were as much liability as asset. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight I was alone with the knowledge that the family I'd tried so hard to honor had become the greatest threat to everything I'd worked to achieve. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy, as if the previous day's crisis had been a nightmare that could be dispelled by routine and familiar surroundings. The Arizona sun streamed through my apartment windows with its usual intensity, the coffee maker gurgled to life on its programmed schedule, and the morning news delivered its standard mixture of local politics and weather forecasts that promised another scorching day in the desert. For a few precious minutes while consciousness returned gradually, I could pretend that everything was still as it had been 24 hours earlier, that my career was secure and my family relationships intact. Reality crashed back as I checked my phone and found 17 missed calls from various Mitchell family members, a string of increasingly urgent text messages from my brother Kevin, and 2 voicemails from extended relatives who had apparently been contacted by Dad about his concerns regarding my mental state and professional stability. The network of family and family friends that had once been a source of support and connection had been weaponized overnight, transformed into an information-gathering system designed to pressure me into submission through collective disapproval and intervention. Kevin's messages were particularly painful to read, not because they were hostile but because they reflected genuine confusion about what was happening and sincere concern for my well-being. As the older sibling and Dad's obvious favorite, Kevin had been insulated from the kind of scrutiny and criticism that had shaped my relationship with our parents. His success as a corporate lawyer had exceeded Dad's expectations without threatening his authority, and his decision to remain in the Phoenix area with his wife Amanda and their son Tyler had reinforced family unity rather than challenging it. From Kevin's perspective, Dad's concerns about my career and personal life were evidence of parental love rather than controlling manipulation. The text messages revealed that Dad had contacted Kevin the previous evening, sharing his version of events that painted me as increasingly unstable and isolated from family support systems. According to Kevin's recounting, Dad was worried that I'd gotten in over my head with federal law enforcement, that the stress and pressure of FBI work was affecting my judgment, and that intervention was necessary before I made career-ending mistakes that would reflect poorly on the entire family. The narrative was compelling because it contained enough elements of truth to be believable, acknowledging the legitimate stresses of federal law enforcement while attributing my independence to psychological problems rather than personal growth. Kevin's concern was genuine, but it was also informed by his limited understanding of my actual work and his tendency to defer to Dad's judgment on matters related to law enforcement. As a corporate lawyer, Kevin dealt with white-collar crime and regulatory compliance issues that occasionally brought him into contact with federal agencies, but he'd never experienced the day-to-day realities of fieldwork, undercover operations, or the kind of life and death decisions that shaped my professional identity. His worldview was organized around negotiation and compromise, finding solutions that satisfied all parties rather than the zero-sum conflicts that characterized criminal investigations. Amanda's addition to the family conversation thread brought a different perspective that was both more supportive and more troubling. As someone who had married into the Mitchell family dynamics rather than being raised within them, she could see patterns and behaviors that seemed normal to those of us who had grown up with them. Her messages suggested that she'd noticed Dad's increasing criticism of my choices over the past few years, his tendency to interpret my career success as personal rejection, and his difficulty accepting that I'd built a life beyond his influence and control. But her observations were tempered by her position as daughter-in-law, which required careful navigation of family politics to maintain harmony and avoid being seen as an outsider who didn't understand Mitchell family values. The family group chat that had developed overnight was a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as loving concern. Each family member who joined the conversation added their own memories of times when I'd seemed stressed or withdrawn, creating a collective narrative that supported Dad's assessment of my declining mental health. The examples they cited were taken out of context and reinterpreted through the lens of his accusations, transforming normal responses to work pressure into evidence of psychological instability. Missed family dinners became signs of social isolation, focus on casework became obsessive behavior, and my general reluctance to discuss FBI investigations became secretiveness that suggested hidden problems. The breakfast that I'd planned to eat while reviewing case files became an exercise in crisis management as I tried to formulate responses that would reassure family members without validating Dad's narrative or providing additional ammunition for his campaign. Each message required careful consideration of how it would be interpreted, forwarded, and potentially used against me in future conversations. The simple act of communicating with people who had known me my entire life had become a tactical challenge that required the same kind of strategic thinking I brought to criminal investigations. The drive to the federal building provided temporary relief from family pressure, but it also highlighted the ways that Dad's accusations were beginning to affect my professional environment. The security guards who had greeted me casually for years now seemed to be paying closer attention to my appearance and demeanor, as if they'd been briefed about potential concerns that required monitoring. The parking garage that had always felt like a routine transition between personal and professional life now felt like a space where I was being evaluated and assessed by invisible observers who might be reporting back to supervisors or internal affairs investigators. Jessica was waiting by my desk with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of expression that suggested she'd spent her evening researching personnel policies and internal affairs procedures. Her law enforcement background had taught her to recognize when situations were more serious than they initially appeared, and her friendship with me had given her insights into family dynamics that made her particularly sensitive to the implications of Dad's interference. The coffee she offered was accompanied by a subtle gesture toward the empty conference room where we could speak privately without being overheard by colleagues who might be curious about unusual family contact with FBI administration. The conversation with Jessica revealed that word of Dad's call to Director Torres had spread through the informal networks that connected FBI offices across different regions and departments. While the details remained confidential, the fact that a family member had contacted FBI leadership with concerns about an agent's fitness for duty was the kind of information that traveled quickly through law enforcement communities. Jessica's contacts at other field offices had heard rumors about a Phoenix agent who was dealing with family interference, though none of them had been given specific names or details about the nature of the allegations. The broader implications of this gossip network were troubling because they suggested that Dad's strategy was succeeding even if his specific accusations were being dismissed by people who knew me professionally. The existence of family concerns about my mental state and professional competence was becoming part of my reputation within federal law enforcement, regardless of whether those concerns were legitimate or fabricated. Future assignments, promotion opportunities, and professional relationships would all be filtered through the awareness that someone in my family considered me unfit for federal service. Jessica's loyalty and support were unwavering, but she was also realistic about the challenges that I would face if Dad continued his campaign of interference and sabotage. Her experience with internal affairs investigations had taught her that even unfounded allegations could derail careers if they were persistent enough to require formal response. The FBI's bureaucratic procedures were designed to err on the side of caution, which meant that security concerns were taken seriously regardless of their source or apparent motivation. If Dad succeeded in creating the impression that multiple family members shared his concerns, or if he could document specific incidents that supported his allegations, the situation could escalate beyond Michael's ability to protect me through informal channels. The morning briefing proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that was probably invisible to most of the agents in attendance but felt overwhelming to me as I tried to maintain professional composure while processing the personal crisis that was unfolding simultaneously. Director Torres conducted the meeting with his usual efficiency and attention to detail, but I could see the strain in his posture and the way his eyes avoided direct contact with mine during discussions of case assignments and operational priorities. The man I loved was being forced to treat me as just another subordinate while dealing with accusations that threatened both our careers. The Morales cartel investigation that had consumed my attention for months suddenly seemed like a luxury I could no longer afford, a complex professional challenge that required focus and energy that were being diverted to family crisis management. The surveillance reports and intelligence analysis that had once been engaging puzzles now felt like obligations that I was fulfilling through discipline rather than genuine interest. The knowledge that my ability to continue working these cases might be compromised by family interference added an element of urgency to every task, as if I needed to accomplish as much as possible before the situation escalated beyond my control. Agent David Rodriguez approached me after the briefing with the kind of casual friendliness that suggested he was unaware of the family crisis but had noticed subtle changes in my behavior or attitude. David had been with the Phoenix office for 8 years, long enough to develop strong professional relationships and a reputation for discretion when colleagues were dealing with personal challenges. His offer to grab lunch and discuss the caseload was probably motivated by genuine collegiality, but it also represented an opportunity to gauge how much my professional demeanor had been affected by the stress of Dad's attacks. The lunch conversation with David at a small Mexican restaurant near the federal building provided welcome normalcy and a chance to remember why I'd chosen federal law enforcement as a career path. His stories about successful investigations and arrests reminded me of the satisfaction that came from protecting communities and pursuing justice against sophisticated criminal organizations. The work we did mattered in ways that transcended office politics and family drama, and the criminals we pursued were genuinely dangerous people whose activities caused real harm to innocent victims. My personal crisis was important, but it was also temporary and manageable compared to the ongoing threat posed by drug trafficking organizations that operated with impunity when law enforcement agencies were distracted or compromised. David's perspective on family interference in law enforcement careers was informed by his own experience with relatives who questioned his decision to work for federal rather than local agencies. His parents had immigrated from Mexico and built successful small businesses through hard work and community connections, but they'd always been suspicious of government authority and concerned about their son's association with federal law enforcement. His success at the FBI had gradually won their respect and support, but the process had required years of patience and consistent demonstration of his competence and integrity. His advice about dealing with family pressure was practical and sympathetic, but it was also based on the assumption that parental concerns were motivated by love rather than the need to control and dominate. The afternoon brought a scheduled meeting with contacts from the Drug Enforcement Administration who were coordinating joint operations along the Arizona-Mexico border.
The casework that had once been challenging and exciting now felt like a performance that required enormous energy to maintain professional standards while my personal life disintegrated. The DEA agents who joined our briefing were experienced professionals who expected accurate intelligence and reliable coordination. But they were also part of the broader law enforcement community where rumors about agent reliability could affect future operational partnerships and joint investigations. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with productive discussions about surveillance priorities and intelligence sharing that advanced our investigation of the Morales organization. My contributions were professional and substantive, demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking and operational awareness that had earned respect from federal partners over the previous 6 years. But the effort required to maintain that level of performance while dealing with family crisis was exhausting in ways that I hadn't anticipated, and I could feel my emotional reserves being depleted by the constant need to compartmentalize personal and professional concerns. Director Torres was notably absent from the DEA coordination meeting, which was unusual given his normal involvement in multi-agency operations and his reputation for hands-on leadership. His absence was probably strategic, designed to avoid situations where his personal knowledge of my family situation might compromise his ability to respond appropriately to concerns raised by federal partners. The protection he was providing by maintaining distance was necessary and appreciated, but it also highlighted the ways that our relationship was creating complications that extended beyond our immediate professional environment. The late afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Mom, who appeared in the federal building lobby with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. Her decision to visit my workplace rather than waiting for family discussions at home was unprecedented and concerning, representing an escalation of family intervention that crossed boundaries I'd thought were firmly established. The fact that she'd passed through federal security and requested permission to speak with me suggested that she was treating this as a crisis that required immediate attention regardless of professional protocols or workplace boundaries. The conversation with Mom in a quiet corner of the building's public lobby was awkward and painful, conducted under the observation of security personnel and curious federal employees who were trying to determine whether this represented a personal emergency or a security concern. Mom's message was consistent with Kevin's texts in the family group chat discussions, expressing concern about my isolation from family support systems and my apparent inability to handle the stress of federal law enforcement. But her delivery was more emotional and less calculated than Dad's systematic campaign, reflecting genuine maternal worry that had been shaped and directed by his narrative about my declining mental health. Mom's presence in the federal building was also a message about the family's willingness to escalate their intervention beyond private conversations and phone calls. Dad had apparently convinced her that the situation was serious enough to justify interrupting my work and potentially compromising my professional reputation through public family drama. The fact that she was willing to take such an unprecedented step suggested that Dad's campaign was succeeding in convincing family members that I was in genuine danger and that extreme measures were justified to protect me from myself. The request for a family dinner that evening was presented as an opportunity for open communication and problem solving, but the timing and circumstances suggested that it was actually a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to overwhelm me with collective family pressure. The combination of Kevin's legal expertise, Amanda's psychological insights, and Mom's emotional appeals would create a formidable coalition that would be difficult to resist or deflect. Dad's absence from the initial invitation was strategic, allowing other family members to present themselves as neutral mediators rather than participants in his campaign to undermine my independence. The decision about whether to attend the family dinner required careful consideration of tactical advantages and potential risks. Refusing the invitation would validate accusations about my isolation and unwillingness to accept family support, but attending would expose me to coordinated pressure designed to extract admissions about my mental state and professional difficulties. The conversation would be conducted on their terms, in their chosen environment, with maximum emotional leverage applied through appeals to family unity and shared concern for my well-being. The alternative was to continue maintaining professional distance while the family crisis escalated, hoping that Dad's campaign would eventually lose momentum or be discredited by lack of concrete evidence. But Mom's visit to the federal building suggested that the family was prepared to escalate their intervention in ways that could compromise my workplace relationships and professional reputation. The choice was between controlled engagement on their terms or continued resistance that might result in even more public and damaging family confrontations. The drive home through Phoenix's evening traffic provided time to consider the strategic implications of each option while trying to maintain focus on immediate safety and operational awareness. The skills that made me effective in criminal investigations were equally applicable to family crisis management, but the emotional stakes were higher and the potential consequences more personally devastating. Dad had chosen his battlefield carefully, using family loyalty and parental authority as weapons against my professional independence and personal autonomy. The apartment that had been a sanctuary was now feeling like a tactical position that needed to be defended against siege warfare. Dad's investigation into my personal life suggested that he might be conducting surveillance or attempting to gather evidence that could support his accusations about my mental state and professional competence. The paranoia was probably excessive, but the stakes were high enough to justify enhanced security measures and careful attention to potential observation or interference. The evening news was running another story about successful federal law enforcement operations, featuring interviews with DEA and FBI officials who described their commitment to protecting American communities from drug trafficking and organized crime. The contrast between the public recognition of federal agents as dedicated professionals and my family's characterization of my career as evidence of mental instability was jarring and dispiriting. The work that provided meaning and purpose to my life was being reframed as pathology that required intervention and correction. The decision about the family dinner couldn't be postponed indefinitely, and each hour of delay was probably being interpreted as additional evidence of my unwillingness to accept help and guidance. The conversation would happen eventually, either on terms that I could partially control or under circumstances that gave Dad maximum advantage in presenting his case for family intervention. The strategic choice was between proactive engagement and reactive resistance, between attempting to manage the crisis or simply enduring whatever consequences emerged from continued conflict. The phone call to Kevin accepting the dinner invitation was brief and careful, designed to convey willingness to participate in family discussions without acknowledging the legitimacy of concerns about my mental state or professional competence. The location at Kevin and Amanda's house rather than the family home was probably intended to create a more neutral environment. But it also represented Amanda's increased involvement in family politics and her potential role as mediator or advocate for whatever intervention strategy had been developed. The preparation for what was essentially a family tribunal required the same kind of strategic thinking that I brought to hostile interrogations or dangerous field operations. The difference was that the adversaries were people who claimed to love me, using emotional manipulation and family loyalty as weapons rather than the straightforward threats and violence that characterized criminal investigations. The betrayal was more devastating because it came from people who were supposed to protect and support me, but the tactical challenges were remarkably similar to those I'd faced in professional contexts. The family dinner at Kevin and Amanda's house in North Phoenix felt like walking into an ambush disguised as a barbecue. Their sprawling ranch-style home sat in one of
those planned communities where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every mailbox matched the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The setting was deliberately comfortable and familiar, designed to lower my defenses and create the impression that this was a casual family gathering rather than a coordinated intervention. But the cars in the driveway told a different story. Not just Kevin and Amanda's vehicles, but Mom's sedan and Dad's pickup truck, indicating that the entire family power structure would be present for whatever confrontation had been carefully orchestrated. Amanda greeted me at the front door with a hug that lasted a few seconds longer than normal, the kind of physical contact that suggested sympathy and concern while also conveying the message that I was fragile and in need of special handling. Her smile was warm but strained, reflecting the awkward position she'd been placed in as both family member and neutral mediator. As someone who had married into the Mitchell dynamics rather than being shaped by them from childhood, Amanda had always been more perceptive about the undercurrents of control and manipulation that the rest of us had learned to accept as normal family interaction. The living room had been arranged to facilitate serious conversation, with chairs positioned in a rough circle that eliminated hiding places and ensured that everyone would be visible to everyone else throughout the discussion. Tyler, their 8-year-old son, was conspicuously absent, apparently having been sent to spend the evening with friends to keep the adult conversation private. The absence of childhood energy and distraction made the house feel more formal and intimidating, like a conference room that happened to have family photos on the walls. Dad was sitting in the recliner that Kevin had positioned to give him the best view of the room and the most authoritative presence in the conversational dynamic. He looked older than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a stiffness in his posture that suggested the stress of orchestrating this family crisis was taking its own toll on his health and well-being. But his expression was determined and confident, the look of a man who believed he was doing necessary work to save his daughter from herself. The retired police sergeant who had taught me about justice and integrity was preparing to use every interrogation technique he'd learned over 30 years to break down my resistance and force compliance with his vision of appropriate behavior. Mom sat on the couch next to Amanda, positioned as the emotional heart of the intervention who could appeal to family bonds and maternal concern when rational arguments failed to achieve the desired results. Her nervousness was evident in the way she kept adjusting her position and checking her phone, but her presence was crucial to Dad's strategy because it demonstrated that his concerns were shared by both parents rather than representing the controlling behavior of a single authoritarian figure. Kevin stood near the kitchen doorway, obviously uncomfortable with his role in the evening's proceedings but committed to supporting family unity even when it required participating in emotional manipulation that went against his natural inclinations. His legal training had taught him to evaluate evidence and construct logical arguments, but his position as Dad's favorite son meant that he was predisposed to accept paternal authority even when it conflicted with his professional judgment about appropriate intervention strategies. The opening moments of the conversation were deceptively casual, with offers of food and drinks that created the illusion of normal family hospitality while everyone settled into their assigned roles for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Amanda had prepared elaborate spread of appetizers and desserts that would normally have been the centerpiece of a celebration, but tonight felt like props in a theatrical production designed to obscure the serious business that had brought everyone together. Dad's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as parental concern, beginning with expressions of love and pride in my accomplishments while gradually introducing doubts about my current trajectory and mental state. He spoke about the stress and pressure of federal law enforcement, acknowledging the legitimate challenges of FBI work while suggesting that I might have reached the limits of my ability to cope effectively with those demands. The transition from support to criticism was so gradual and skillfully executed that it would have been difficult to identify the exact moment when concern became attack. The specific accusations that followed were more detailed and personal than I had expected, suggesting that Dad had been conducting systematic surveillance and investigation of my activities over the past several months. He knew about missed family events that I hadn't mentioned to anyone, changes in my routine that could only have been observed through regular monitoring, and even details about my appearance and demeanor that indicated close observation during what I had thought were private moments. The realization that I had been under family surveillance while maintaining operational security for my relationship with Michael was both professionally embarrassing and personally violating. Dad's evidence package included photographs that he'd apparently taken during his surveillance activities, showing me at restaurants and locations that were far from my normal routine and in the company of people he couldn't identify. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but they clearly showed me engaged in what appeared to be romantic dinners and intimate conversations with a man whose face was partially obscured by angle and lighting. Dad had unknowingly documented my secret relationship with Michael without being able to identify him as my FBI supervisor, creating evidence that supported his accusations about secretive behavior while missing the most damaging truth about workplace policy violations. The presentation of surveillance evidence transformed the family dinner from emotional intervention into something resembling a criminal prosecution, with Dad assuming the role of prosecutor, while the rest of the family served as jury members who would ultimately decide whether his accusations warranted the extreme measures he was proposing. Kevin's legal training made him uncomfortable with the investigative methods that Dad had used, but his family loyalty prevented him from challenging the appropriateness of surveillance and evidence gathering that would have been illegal if conducted by law enforcement without proper authorization. Mom's reaction to the photographs was particularly painful to witness, as she clearly recognized the implications of clandestine romantic relationships while being unable to identify the specific man who appeared in the images. Her maternal instincts were focused on protection rather than prosecution, leading her to ask questions about my safety and emotional well-being rather than demanding explanations about policy violations or professional misconduct. The contrast between her genuine concern and Dad's calculated attack highlighted the different motivations that had brought them to support his intervention strategy. Amanda's response was more analytical and less emotional, reflecting her background in marketing and her understanding of how images could be manipulated to support predetermined narratives. She asked pointed questions about the context and timing of the photographs, noting that romantic relationships were not inherently evidence of mental instability or professional incompetence. Her willingness to challenge Dad's interpretation of the evidence created tension in the room and highlighted the fact that not all family members were convinced by his arguments about my declining mental health. The revelation about Michael's identity came not through Dad's investigation, but through my own decision to end the charade that was destroying my relationship with people I loved despite their willingness to betray my trust. The stress of maintaining lies and deflecting accusations while protecting a man who had shown me nothing but support and understanding became unbearable as I watched my family tear apart my character based on incomplete information and malicious assumptions. The announcement that the unidentified man in Dad's surveillance photographs was Director Michael Torres, my supervisor at the FBI and the same person Dad had contacted with concerns about my mental state, created a moment of stunned silence that felt like the calm before an explosive thunderstorm. Kevin's legal mind immediately grasped the implications for both my career and Dad's credibility, while Mom's maternal instincts shifted from concern about my romantic choices to horror at the potential consequences of workplace policy violations that could end my federal law enforcement career. Dad's reaction was the most complex and revealing, cycling through disbelief, anger, and what appeared to be genuine shock at the discovery that his carefully crafted strategy had been undermined by information he hadn't been able to gather through surveillance and investigation. The man he had contacted to report concerns about my reliability and mental state was the same person who knew me most intimately and was therefore least likely to believe accusations about psychological instability or professional incompetence. His entire campaign had been built on the assumption that FBI leadership would take his concerns seriously and investigate accordingly, but he had unknowingly contacted the one person who could definitively refute every allegation he had made. The strategic implications of Dad's mistake were immediately apparent to everyone in the room, but the personal implications were even more devastating for our family relationships. His systematic surveillance and investigation of my private life had been motivated not by concern for my well-being, but by the need to gather evidence that could be used to control and manipulate my career choices. The discovery that I had been maintaining a successful romantic relationship while excelling in my professional responsibilities undermined his narrative about my inability to handle adult responsibilities and make appropriate life decisions. Kevin's attempts to manage the fallout from Dad's tactical error reflected his discomfort with the methods that had been used and his growing awareness that family intervention had crossed ethical boundaries that he couldn't professionally support. His questions about the legality of surveillance activities and the appropriateness of contacting federal employers with unsubstantiated concerns showed that his legal training was finally overriding his family loyalty. The brother who had been prepared to support Dad's intervention was beginning to understand that those activities might have created legal exposure for the entire family. Amanda's response was more direct and emotionally honest, expressing anger at being manipulated into participating in what was essentially a harassment campaign against someone she cared about. Her position as an outsider who had married into the family dynamics gave her the perspective to recognize Dad's behavior as abusive and controlling rather than loving and protective. The woman who had been prepared to serve as mediator and family diplomat was now confronting the reality that she had been recruited as an unwitting accomplice in systematic psychological warfare. Mom's emotional breakdown was the most difficult aspect of the evening to witness, as she struggled to reconcile her genuine love and concern for my well-being with the growing awareness that Dad's intervention had been motivated by control rather than care. Her tears reflected not just sadness about family conflict but genuine horror at the discovery that she had been complicit in activities that were designed to damage rather than protect her daughter's future. The woman who had raised me to be strong and independent was confronting the reality that she had been manipulated into participating in efforts to undermine those very qualities. The conversation that followed was raw and painful, stripping away years of family mythology about love and support to reveal the underlying power dynamics that had always shaped our relationships. Dad's need to control and dominate had been disguised as parental guidance for so long that even he seemed surprised by the viciousness of his own behavior when it was exposed and examined in detail. The man who had taught me about justice and integrity was being forced to confront evidence that he had abandoned those principles when they conflicted with his personal desires for authority and control. The resolution came not through family reconciliation but through clear boundary setting that acknowledged the damage that had been done while protecting against future interference and manipulation.
My announcement that I would be limiting contact with family members who had participated in surveillance and harassment activities was met with protests about family loyalty and unity. But the consequences of their choices had to be acknowledged and addressed regardless of their intentions or motivations. The relationship with Michael had survived Dad's attack not because we had been particularly clever or fortunate, but because love and trust had proven stronger than manipulation and deception. His support throughout the crisis had demonstrated the difference between relationships built on mutual respect and those based on control and dominance. The man Dad had tried to turn against me had instead become my strongest ally and advocate, validating my worth and capabilities in ways that family members had never been willing to do. The professional consequences were ultimately minimal because Dad's strategy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. His contact with Michael had been dismissed as family interference rather than legitimate security concerns, and the documentation of his surveillance activities had actually created evidence of harassment that protected me from future accusations. The FBI's internal affairs procedures had worked as designed, distinguishing between real security concerns and personal vendettas disguised as official reporting. The personal transformation was more significant and lasting than any professional vindication could have been. The crisis had forced me to choose between family approval and personal integrity, between maintaining comfortable illusions and confronting difficult truths about the people who had shaped my childhood and early career. The daughter who had spent years trying to earn parental approval had finally learned that some relationships were too toxic to maintain regardless of biological connections or shared history. 6 months later, I stood in the same Phoenix courthouse where I had testified in dozens of federal cases, but this time I was there for a different kind of justice. Dad's surveillance and harassment activities had finally attracted the attention of federal authorities who took a dim view of retired law enforcement officers using their connections and expertise to interfere with active FBI personnel. The charges were relatively minor: harassment, misuse of police contacts, and violation of federal employee privacy rights, but the symbolism was profound. Michael and I had made our relationship public after the crisis resolved, following proper FBI procedures for disclosure and conflict management. The process had been awkward and bureaucratic, but it had also been honest and transparent in ways that our secret romance had never been. The man who had stood by me during the worst family crisis of my life had proven worthy of public acknowledgement and official recognition as my partner in both professional and personal contexts. The work continued with renewed focus and energy, freed from the distraction of family drama and the stress of maintaining elaborate operational security for a relationship that deserved celebration rather than concealment. The Morales cartel investigation had concluded successfully with arrests and prosecutions that disrupted a major drug trafficking organization, providing the kind of professional satisfaction that made all the personal turmoil worthwhile. The apartment in Scottsdale had been replaced by a house in Paradise Valley that Michael and I shared openly, without surveillance concerns or family interference. The space was filled with evidence of a life built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the careful performance that had characterized my previous attempts to earn approval from people who were never going to offer it unconditionally. The family relationships that survived were stronger and more honest than those that had been lost, built on acceptance of boundaries and respect for adult autonomy, rather than the controlling dynamics that had defined the Mitchell family culture for generations. Kevin and Amanda had eventually apologized for their participation in Dad's campaign, acknowledging that love and concern had been manipulated to serve purposes that were destructive rather than protective. The final vindication came not from any formal judgment or official recognition, but from the simple knowledge that I had chosen correctly when forced to decide between family loyalty and personal integrity. The daughter who had been characterized as mentally unstable and professionally incompetent had not only survived the most sustained attack on her character and career, but had emerged stronger and more confident than ever before. The sunset over the Phoenix desert painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as I finished writing my incident report about Dad's harassment campaign, documenting the events for official records that would protect other federal employees from similar family interference. The beauty of the desert evening was a reminder that some storms passed quickly while others created lasting change, but that survival and growth were always possible for those willing to fight for what they deserved. The phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, who was texting photos from her own family barbecue where normal people celebrated relationships and achievements without surveillance or psychological warfare. Her friendship had been a constant source of support and perspective throughout the crisis, reminding me that healthy family dynamics were possible even in the high-stress world of federal law enforcement. Michael appeared in the doorway of my home office, offering a glass of wine and the kind of smile that suggested he was proud of my strength and resilience in handling an impossible situation with grace and integrity. The man Dad had tried to turn against me had instead become the foundation for a life built on honest communication and mutual respect, proving that love could triumph over manipulation when people chose truth over comfortable lies. The evening ahead promised dinner preparations and quiet conversation, the kind of domestic normalcy that had been impossible during months of crisis management and family warfare. The simple pleasure of planning a meal together without worrying about surveillance or interference was a luxury that I would never again take for granted. The work would continue tomorrow with new cases and fresh challenges, but tonight belonged to celebration of survival and victory against forces that had seemed overwhelming just months earlier. The FBI agent who had been targeted for destruction by her own family had not only survived the attack but had discovered strengths and resources that made her more effective in both professional and personal contexts. The desert wind carried the scent of blooming cactus and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate, reminding me that life continued in all its messy complexity beyond the boundaries of family drama and workplace politics. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything I valued had instead cleared away illusions and pretenses that had limited my potential for genuine happiness and authentic relationships. The story wasn't over, but this chapter had ended with truth triumphant over deception, love stronger than manipulation, and integrity more valuable than family approval that came at the cost of personal autonomy and professional independence. The daughter who had spent years trying to earn love through compliance had finally learned that real love never required the surrender of self-respect or personal values. The breaking point arrived at exactly 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon when I walked into Director Torres's office for what I assumed would be another routine case briefing, only to find Deputy Director Patricia Williams from the Phoenix Regional Office sitting beside his desk with a thick folder labeled Internal Affairs Investigation Agent S. Mitchell. The sight of that folder, combined with Patricia's grave expression and Michael's barely controlled tension, told me that Dad's campaign had finally achieved what he'd been working toward for weeks. Patricia Williams was a legend in federal law enforcement circles, a former Marine Corps officer who had risen through FBI ranks during an era when women faced significantly more barriers to advancement than they did today. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for any behavior that compromised the integrity of federal operations, and her presence in Michael's office meant that someone with serious credibility had raised concerns that couldn't be dismissed through informal channels. The woman who could make or break careers with a single recommendation was studying me with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested she was already forming conclusions about my fitness for continued federal service. Michael's introduction was painfully formal, using my full title and emphasizing my years of exemplary service, while carefully avoiding any personal warmth that might suggest inappropriate familiarity between supervisor and subordinate. The man who had held me while I cried about family betrayal was now maintaining the professional distance required by his position, though I could see the strain in his jaw and the way his hands remained rigidly clasped on his desk. The performance was necessary for both our protection, but it felt like another layer of betrayal added to the systematic destruction of relationships that had once provided stability and meaning. Patricia's opening statement was delivered with the kind of measured precision that suggested she had dealt with similar situations before, and understood both the procedural requirements and the human complexity of investigating federal employees whose personal lives intersected with their professional responsibilities. She explained that the FBI had received multiple contacts expressing concerns about my mental stability, professional judgment, and potential security risks that warranted formal review rather than informal resolution. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, but the implications were devastating for everything I had worked to achieve over 6 years of dedicated service. The scope of the investigation was broader than I had anticipated, encompassing not just Dad's-specific accusations but also any patterns of behavior that might support concerns about my reliability or trustworthiness. Patricia's questions covered everything from my financial situation and family relationships to my social activities and romantic involvements, creating a comprehensive examination of my personal life that would either vindicate me completely or provide ammunition for those who wanted to see me removed from federal service. The process was designed to be thorough and fair, but it was also inherently invasive and professionally damaging regardless of its ultimate conclusions. The revelation that Patricia already knew about my relationship with Michael came as both relief and terror, eliminating the need for deception while highlighting the serious policy violations that could end both our careers. Her knowledge of our connection had come not through Dad's investigation but through the FBI's own internal monitoring systems, which had detected patterns in our communication and scheduling that suggested personal involvement beyond normal supervisory relationships. The same operational security measures that we had thought protected our privacy had actually created digital footprints that were visible to anyone with sufficient access and analytical capability. Michael's acknowledgement of our relationship was professionally devastating but personally courageous, as he took full responsibility for initiating and maintaining a connection that violated FBI policies regarding supervisor-subordinate relationships. His willingness to accept career-ending consequences to protect me from accusations of manipulation or coercion demonstrated the depth of his integrity and the authenticity of his feelings, even as it confirmed the worst fears about the professional risks we had been taking for 2 years. The man who had everything to lose by admitting our relationship chose honesty over self-preservation, validating my trust in ways that no family member had ever been willing to do. Patricia's response to Michael's confession was more nuanced than I had expected, reflecting her understanding of the human complexities that existed within bureaucratic structures designed to prevent conflicts of interest and abuse of authority. Her questions focused on the timeline of our relationship relative to my performance evaluations and case assignments, seeking to determine whether personal feelings had compromised professional judgment or created opportunities for favoritism that would undermine the integrity of FBI operations. The investigation was shifting from criminal misconduct to administrative violation, which carried different consequences but still threatened everything we had built together. The examination of my casework over the past 2 years was exhaustive and nerve-wracking, as Patricia reviewed every arrest, every report, and every decision I had made while maintaining a secret relationship with my supervisor. Her analysis was looking for evidence that personal feelings had influenced professional choices, that Michael had shown favoritism in assignments or evaluations, or that our relationship had created security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors. The scrutiny was intense and uncomfortable, but it also revealed the consistency and quality of my work even during periods of significant personal stress and emotional complexity. The turning point in the investigation came when Patricia interviewed Jessica and other colleagues who had worked closely with me throughout the period when my relationship with Michael was developing and deepening. Their unanimous testimony about my professionalism, competence, and dedication provided compelling evidence that personal relationships had not compromised my ability to perform essential law enforcement functions. Jessica's particular insight into my character and work ethic carried special weight because of her own reputation for integrity and her position as someone who would have been likely to notice any deterioration in my professional standards. The interview with DEA contacts who had participated in joint operations provided additional validation of my professional capabilities and personal reliability during high-stress situations that required absolute trust and coordination. Their assessment of my performance during undercover operations and sensitive investigations demonstrated that I had maintained operational security and professional focus even while managing the complex emotional demands of a secret relationship. The external validation from federal partners who had no stake in FBI internal politics was particularly valuable in countering Dad's accusations about my mental stability and professional competence. The confrontation with Dad himself was inevitable and professionally necessary, as Patricia's investigation required direct examination of his motives and credibility as a source of concerns about my fitness for federal service. The retired police sergeant who had launched this entire crisis was summoned to the FBI field office for an interview that would determine whether his accusations warranted continued investigation or could be dismissed as family interference motivated by personal rather than professional concerns. His confidence in his strategy was about to be tested by someone with decades of experience in distinguishing legitimate security concerns from personal vendettas.
Disguised as official reporting. Dad's performance during his interview with Patricia was both impressive and ultimately self-defeating, as his law enforcement experience allowed him to present his concerns in professional language while his emotional investment in controlling my life choices became increasingly apparent under skilled questioning. His detailed knowledge of my activities and relationships demonstrated systematic surveillance that went far beyond normal parental concern, while his inability to provide concrete evidence of professional misconduct or security violations exposed the weakness of his underlying case. The man who had been so confident in his strategy was being dismantled by someone with superior investigative skills and no emotional investment in the outcome. Patricia's analysis of Dad's surveillance activities revealed several concerning aspects that shifted the focus of her investigation from my conduct to his potential harassment and interference with federal personnel. The photographs he had taken, the contacts he had made with my colleagues, and the systematic nature of his campaign to undermine my career were beginning to look less like concerned parenting and more like criminal behavior that warranted its own federal investigation. The hunter had become the hunted as his methods were examined by professionals who understood the difference between legitimate oversight and systematic harassment. The revelation about the extent of Dad's law enforcement contacts and his use of those relationships to gather information about my professional activities opened up additional lines of inquiry that had implications beyond my individual case. Patricia's investigation was uncovering a network of retired and active law enforcement personnel who had been sharing confidential information and coordinating activities that potentially violated federal regulations about privacy and interference with government operations. The scope of misconduct was expanding beyond family drama into areas that could result in criminal prosecution and civil liability for multiple participants. Kevin's interview with Patricia was particularly painful to observe as my brother struggled to reconcile his loyalty to Dad with his growing awareness that family intervention had crossed legal and ethical boundaries that put him at risk as a practicing attorney. His legal training made him acutely aware of the potential consequences of participating in harassment campaigns against federal employees, while his family loyalty prevented him from completely abandoning Dad's narrative about concern for my well-being. The conflict between professional obligations and family pressure was tearing him apart in ways that were visible and heartbreaking. Amanda's testimony provided crucial insight into the family dynamics that had motivated Dad's campaign, as her perspective as an outsider who had married into the Mitchell family allowed her to identify patterns of control and manipulation that family members had learned to accept as normal. Her description of Dad's increasing frustration with my independence and his systematic efforts to undermine my confidence and autonomy painted a picture of psychological abuse disguised as parental guidance. The woman who had been recruited as a mediator was now providing evidence that supported federal intervention to protect me from continued harassment. The medical evaluation that Patricia ordered was both humiliating and validating, as federal psychologists conducted comprehensive assessments designed to determine whether Dad's accusations about my mental stability had any basis in clinical reality. The process was invasive and uncomfortable, requiring detailed discussions of personal history, family relationships, and emotional responses to stress that exposed vulnerabilities I had spent years learning to manage privately. But the results were unambiguous in concluding that I was mentally healthy, professionally competent, and fully capable of handling the responsibilities of federal law enforcement service. The polygraph examination that accompanied the psychological evaluation was equally thorough and ultimately exonerating, as federal examiners tested my truthfulness about everything from drug use and financial problems to foreign contacts and security violations. The questions were designed to uncover any concealed information that could support Dad's accusations or reveal other concerns that might justify continued investigation. My successful completion of the examination with no indicators of deception provided objective evidence that countered every major allegation that had been made about my reliability and trustworthiness. Patricia's final report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision that systematically dismantled Dad's accusations while documenting the policy violations that Michael and I had committed through our undisclosed relationship. Her conclusions acknowledged that we had violated FBI regulations about supervisor-subordinate relationships while finding no evidence that those violations had compromised professional performance or created security vulnerabilities. The report recommended administrative sanctions rather than criminal prosecution, recognizing the human complexity of workplace relationships while maintaining institutional standards for professional conduct. The administrative hearing that followed Patricia's investigation was conducted with the kind of formal ceremony that emphasized the seriousness of policy violations while allowing for mitigation based on circumstances and character evidence. Michael and I appeared together before a panel of senior FBI officials who would determine the consequences for our relationship and our continued employment with federal law enforcement. The proceeding was fair and thorough, but it was also a public acknowledgement that our personal choices had created professional complications that required institutional response. Michael's decision to request transfer to a different field office was both professionally wise and personally devastating, as it represented the sacrifice of career advancement opportunities to preserve our relationship and protect me from accusations of continued policy violations. His willingness to accept assignment to a smaller office with fewer resources and lower visibility demonstrated his commitment commitment to our future together while acknowledging the professional consequences of his choices. The man who had risen to director level was accepting demotion and geographical displacement to protect what we had built during 2 years of secrecy and sacrifice. My own disciplinary outcome was less severe but still professionally significant, consisting of formal reprimand and mandatory transfer to a different supervisory chain that would eliminate any appearance of favoritism or continued policy violations. The sanctions were recorded in my personnel file and would affect future promotion opportunities, but they allowed me to continue working in federal law enforcement with the same security clearance and operational responsibilities. The career that Dad had tried to destroy was surviving with damage but not destruction, proving that truth and competence could overcome systematic attack when supported by institutional fairness. The criminal charges against Dad were filed 6 months after Patricia's investigation concluded, when federal prosecutors determined that his surveillance and harassment activities constituted criminal interference with federal personnel that warranted prosecution rather than administrative resolution. The retired police sergeant who had used his law enforcement connections to attack his daughter's career was facing federal felony charges that could result in prison time and permanent loss of his law enforcement benefits. The man who had claimed to be protecting me from myself was being prosecuted for crimes against me that had been motivated by control rather than concern. The trial was a media sensation that attracted attention from law enforcement communities across the country as reporters and commentators debated the boundaries between parental concern and criminal harassment in cases involving adult children with high-security government positions. Dad's conviction on multiple federal charges validated Patricia's investigation and my decision to resist family pressure rather than capitulating to demands that would have compromised my professional integrity and personal autonomy. The verdict was both personal vindication and professional protection, ensuring that future family interference would be met with criminal prosecution rather than administrative tolerance. Michael's new assignment in Albuquerque provided opportunities for us to build a relationship without the complications of workplace hierarchy and policy violations that had shaped our early connection. The distance from Phoenix and the toxic family dynamics that had nearly destroyed my career was therapeutic and liberating, allowing us to focus on building a future together rather than managing crises that threatened to overwhelm our ability to maintain both professional and personal commitments. The love that had survived systematic attack and bureaucratic investigation was proving stronger than the obstacles that had been designed to destroy it. The wedding took place 2 years later in a small ceremony attended by FBI colleagues who had supported us throughout the investigation and its aftermath, along with the few family members who had chosen truth over loyalty to Dad's manipulative narrative. Jessica served as my maid of honor, representing the friendship that had sustained me through the worst period of my professional life, while Kevin walked me down the aisle in acknowledgement of his eventual choice to support my independence rather than family pressure. The celebration was modest but meaningful, marking not just the formalization of our relationship but the triumph of integrity over manipulation and love over control. The work continued with renewed purpose and effectiveness as my transfer to financial crimes investigation provided opportunities to pursue complex cases involving fraud and corruption that challenged my analytical skills while contributing to public safety and justice. The clearance rate and conviction statistics that I achieved in my new assignment demonstrated that the controversy surrounding my relationship had not compromised my professional capabilities or dedication to federal law enforcement mission. The agent who had been targeted for destruction was performing at the highest levels while building a life based on honesty and mutual respect. The house that Michael and I purchased in the foothills outside Albuquerque was filled with evidence of a partnership built on equality and shared values rather than the hierarchy and control that had characterized my childhood family environment. The space was ours to design and arrange according to our preferences and needs without surveillance or interference from people who claimed authority over our personal choices. The simple pleasure of decorating rooms and planting gardens together was a daily reminder that healthy relationships enhanced rather than diminished individual autonomy and professional achievement. The contact with Mom that resumed gradually over several years was tentative and carefully bounded, based on her acknowledgement of the damage that family loyalty had caused and her commitment to respecting boundaries that protected against future manipulation. Her relationship with Dad had not survived his criminal conviction and the exposure of his systematic campaign against me, as she finally recognized the difference between love and control that had shaped decades of family dysfunction. The mother who had been manipulated into supporting psychological warfare against her daughter was slowly learning to build connections based on respect rather than compliance. The scholarship program that Michael and I established for children of law enforcement families was designed to support young people who wanted to pursue careers in federal service while maintaining independence from family members who might see their success as threats to traditional authority structures. The annual awards ceremony brought together students who were building lives based on their own values and aspirations rather than conforming to family expectations that limited their potential for growth and achievement. The investment in future law enforcement professionals was both personal healing and professional contribution to communities that benefited from diverse and independent thinking. The book that I eventually wrote about family manipulation and workplace relationships in federal law enforcement became a resource for other agents dealing with similar conflicts between personal autonomy and family loyalty. The publication provided opportunities to share lessons learned from surviving systematic attack while maintaining professional integrity and personal relationships. The response from readers who found validation and guidance in my story confirmed that the experience had value beyond personal healing and professional advancement. The sunset over the Sandra Mountains painted the New Mexico sky in brilliant colors as I finished updating case files and prepared to leave the FBI field office for another evening of domestic normalcy and personal fulfillment. The beauty of the high desert landscape was a daily reminder that life continued in all its complexity and possibility beyond the boundaries of family drama and bureaucratic politics. The agent who had been targeted for destruction had not only survived the attack but had discovered strengths and resources that made her more effective in both professional and personal contexts. The phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, who was texting photos from her latest case success and expressing pride in the career advancement that had followed her support during my crisis. Her friendship remained a constant source of perspective and encouragement, reminding me that healthy professional relationships were possible even in high-stress environments where trust and reliability were essential for both safety and success. The bond forged during investigation and controversy had deepened into lifelong connection based on mutual respect and shared values. Michael appeared in the doorway of my office, offering car keys and the kind of smile that suggested he was looking forward to an evening of cooking dinner together and planning a weekend trip to Santa Fe for antiquing and gallery browsing. The man who had risked his career to protect our relationship had become the foundation for a life built on honest communication and equal partnership, proving that love could triumph over institutional obstacles when people chose authenticity over convenience. The drive home through Albuquerque's evening traffic provided time to reflect on the journey from family crisis to personal triumph that had reshaped my understanding of relationships, integrity, and the difference between love and control. The daughter who had spent years trying to earn approval through compliance had finally learned that real love never required the surrender of personal autonomy or professional ambition. The story wasn't over, but this chapter had ended with truth triumphant over deception and authentic relationships stronger than manipulative family bonds. 5 years after the federal courthouse in Phoenix had echoed with testimony about surveillance, harassment, and family betrayal, I stood in the lecture hall at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, addressing a room full of new agents who would soon face their own challenges in balancing personal relationships with professional obligations. The invitation to speak at the Academy represented full rehabilitation from the controversy that had once threatened to end my career, but more importantly, it provided an opportunity to share hard-won wisdom about maintaining integrity under pressure and recognizing manipulation disguised as love. The young faces in the audience reminded me of my own naive confidence when I had graduated from this same program 8 years earlier, convinced that good intentions and hard work would be sufficient to navigate the complex ethical challenges that awaited in federal law enforcement. Their notebooks were open, pens ready to capture practical advice about case management and operational security, but the most important lessons couldn't be outlined in bullet points or memorized for examinations. The qualities that determine success or failure in federal service were character traits that emerged under stress when personal costs made integrity expensive and family pressure made compromise seem reasonable. My presentation focused on the subtle forms of corruption that didn't involve money or criminal conspiracy, but rather the gradual erosion of professional boundaries through emotional manipulation and personal relationships that created conflicts of interest. The agents in training needed to understand that threats to their careers would come not just from hostile foreign intelligence services or sophisticated criminal organizations, but from people who claimed to love them and insisted they were acting in their best interests. The most dangerous compromises began with small accommodations to family expectations that seemed harmless but established patterns of prioritizing personal loyalty over professional responsibility. The question and answer session that followed revealed how common family interference was in law enforcement careers, as young agents shared stories about parents who expected special treatment for traffic violations, siblings who wanted inside information about ongoing investigations, and relatives who couldn't understand why federal agents couldn't bend rules for family members. Their experiences validated my decision to speak publicly about the price of maintaining professional integrity when family members viewed law enforcement careers as resources to be exploited rather than public service commitments that required absolute honesty and impartiality.
The private conversation with Academy leadership after my presentation provided insight into systemic changes that had resulted from high-profile cases involving family interference and workplace relationships. The FBI had implemented new training programs about recognizing and reporting attempted manipulation by family members while also clarifying policies about romantic relationships between supervisors and subordinates. The institutional learning that had emerged from my case and others like it was helping to protect future agents from similar attacks on their professional integrity and personal autonomy. The drive from Quantico back to our home in the Virginia suburbs gave me time to process the emotional weight of revisiting painful memories for educational purposes while celebrating how completely my life had been transformed by choosing truth over comfort. The cherry trees lining the Potomac were beginning to bloom, marking another spring in a life that had been rebuilt on foundations of honesty and mutual respect rather than the shifting ground of family manipulation and institutional politics. The seasonal renewal felt symbolic of the personal growth that had emerged from surviving systematic attack and discovering inner resources that proved stronger than external pressure. Michael was waiting in the kitchen when I arrived home, preparing dinner with the kind of focused attention that had made him effective as an FBI director and now served him well as a private security consultant who advised corporations about executive protection and threat assessment. His career transition after leaving federal service had been challenging but ultimately rewarding, providing opportunities to use his law enforcement expertise while avoiding the bureaucratic constraints that had made our relationship so complicated during our early years together. The man who had sacrificed advancement opportunities to protect our connection had found professional fulfillment that didn't require choosing between personal happiness and career success. The conversation over dinner ranged from academy gossip and policy updates to planning for our upcoming vacation in Costa Rica, where we would spend 2 weeks hiking mountain trails and exploring cloud forests without phones or internet connections that could intrude on private time. The simple pleasure of discussing travel arrangements and restaurant recommendations highlighted how normal our life had become after years of crisis management and legal proceedings that had dominated every conversation and decision. The relationship that had once required elaborate operational security now thrived in complete transparency and openness. The evening news was running a story about federal prosecutions of public corruption that included footage of agents making arrests and seizing evidence from elected officials who had betrayed public trust for personal gain. The reporter's discussion of integrity in government service was ironic given the family crisis that had once threatened my own career through accusations of mental instability and professional incompetence. The work that continued in federal law enforcement was still vital and challenging, requiring agents who could resist pressure from all sources and maintain commitment to justice regardless of personal costs. The phone call from Jessica interrupted our post-dinner relaxation on the back deck where we had been watching Cardinals and Blue Jays compete for access to the bird feeder that Michael had installed after discovering my interest in amateur ornithology. Jessica's excitement about her recent promotion to supervisory special agent in the Denver field office was infectious and gratifying, representing career advancement that had been earned through competence and dedication rather than political connections or family influence. Her success validated the support network that had sustained both of us through professional challenges and personal growth that required courage and persistence. The update about Dad's situation was less celebratory but still significant for understanding the long-term consequences of choosing manipulation over honesty in family relationships. His federal conviction had resulted in 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by supervised probation that included restrictions on contact with law enforcement personnel and mandatory counseling about appropriate boundaries in family relationships. The retirement benefits he had forfeited through criminal conviction meant that his financial security was severely compromised, while his reputation in law enforcement communities had been permanently damaged by publicity surrounding his harassment campaign against me. Mom's gradual reintegration into my life had been carefully managed through family therapy sessions that helped establish healthy boundaries and communication patterns that didn't repeat the dysfunctional dynamics that had enabled Dad's controlling behavior for decades. Her decision to divorce him after his conviction had been painful but necessary for her own emotional well-being and our possibility of rebuilding a relationship based on respect rather than manipulation. The woman who had been complicit in psychological warfare against her daughter was slowly learning to express love through support rather than control. Kevin's law practice had survived the scandal but never fully recovered from the association with federal criminal activity and family dysfunction that had been extensively covered in legal publications and local media. His marriage to Amanda had been strengthened by the crisis that forced both of them to confront uncomfortable truths about family loyalty and moral courage when faced with systematic wrongdoing. The brother who had initially supported Dad's intervention was now one of my strongest advocates for maintaining boundaries that protected against future manipulation and interference. The scholarship program that Michael and I had established 5 years earlier was now providing annual awards to 12 students from law enforcement families who demonstrated academic excellence and commitment to public service careers that prioritized integrity over family expectations. The selection committee included federal agents, prosecutors, and judges who understood the unique pressures faced by young people whose career choices might conflict with family traditions or create tension with relatives who expected special treatment or inside information. The investment in future law enforcement professionals was both personal healing and professional contribution to institutional integrity. The book signing at the local Barnes & Noble had drawn an audience that included current and former federal agents, family members dealing with similar manipulation, and general readers interested in stories about standing up to systematic psychological abuse disguised as parental concern. The questions from audience members revealed how common these dynamics were across professions and family structures, validating my decision to share personal experiences that might help others recognize and resist similar attacks on their autonomy and professional integrity. The retirement party for Director Williams 6 months earlier had provided opportunity to reconnect with FBI colleagues who had supported me during the investigation that could have ended my career but instead became a model for how institutions should respond to family interference and policy violations involving workplace relationships. Patricia's leadership during that crisis had demonstrated the difference between bureaucratic cover-up and genuine commitment to fairness and truth-finding that protected both individual rights and institutional integrity. The anniversary of our wedding approached with plans for a quiet celebration that would include the small group of friends and family members who had supported our relationship through controversy and vindication. The guest list was shorter than it might have been in a different family situation, but it was composed entirely of people who had chosen truth over convenience and authentic relationship over social expectations. The quality of connections had proven more valuable than quantity of relatives who demanded loyalty without offering respect. The garden behind our Virginia home was coming into full bloom as spring advanced towards summer, with roses and lavender that we had planted together during our first year of marriage beginning to mature into the landscape vision we had shared while planning our life away from Phoenix and the toxic family dynamics that had shaped my early understanding of love and loyalty. The physical space that we had created together reflected the emotional territory we had claimed through choosing honesty over manipulation and mutual respect over hierarchical control. The evening walk through our neighborhood provided time to reflect on the journey from family crisis to personal triumph that had reshaped my understanding of relationships, integrity, and the difference between love and control. The houses we passed contained other families dealing with their own challenges and celebrating their own successes, reminding me that human complexity extended far beyond the specific dynamics that had shaped my own experience. The perspective that came from surviving systematic attack had made me more compassionate toward others facing similar choices between family loyalty and personal integrity. The sunset painted the Virginia sky in gentle pastels that contrasted with the harsh desert light of Phoenix, where this story had begun with a father's decision to destroy his daughter's career rather than accept her independence and success. The geographical distance represented emotional healing that had been necessary for building a life based on chosen family rather than biological connections that demanded surrender of personal autonomy. The landscape of rolling hills and mature forests felt like home in ways that the Arizona desert never had, despite years of childhood memories embedded in that harsh but beautiful terrain. The phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler, Kevin's son, who was now 15 and considering law enforcement as a career path that would honor family tradition while avoiding the controlling dynamics that had characterized previous generations. His questions about federal service and college preparation represented hope for breaking cycles of manipulation and control that had damaged relationships and careers across decades of Mitchell family history. The investment in his future success felt like redemption for past failures and validation of choices that had seemed impossibly difficult during the crisis years. The end of another day brought gratitude for survival and growth that had seemed unlikely during the darkest moments of family warfare and professional uncertainty. The woman who had been targeted for destruction by her own father had not only survived the attack but had discovered strengths and resources that made her more effective in both personal and professional contexts. The story wasn't over, but this chapter had ended with truth triumphant over deception and authentic relationships stronger than manipulative family bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.